Okay, so we're going to do a short recap of what happened from the stream. I forgot to press record like the idiot that I am, so we're just going to condense what we talked about today. So we talked a lot about the Torig's Pact, fiasco, whatever you want to call it. It's a bug. It's hopefully getting fixed. Gina Bruno mentioned on the forums, an official dev said we have it planned being fixed on Monday for the PTS. So we will be testing that on Monday. In terms of the set in general, is it still going to be good after the nerf? Right now, I believe the bug is it's proccing every 0.8 seconds because Torig's Infused is being additive instead of multiplicative. So it's 80% cooldown reduction instead of 65% cooldown reduction. So hopefully when that gets fixed, Torig's Pact will be doing less DPS, roughly half the DPS on your enchants, but still, if you've seen some of these crazy parses that some people have been posting, enchants when you add them together are doing like 15k DPS, so they're still going to be doing 6 to 7k DPS. So Torig's, even after the fix, might still be overperforming in some situations. The other thing to keep in mind about that, though, is that Torig's Pact is pure single target, because this enchant that we see can only happen to one target. So even if I have 50 enemies in front of me and I place down my wall of elements, only one of them is going to be hit. So if I'm doing large AoE situations and I'm using Infused paired with a proc enchant, it's not going to be as efficient as it is on a target dummy where I only have pure single target. So it's all about context going into Horns of the Reach. We've talked about it in previous streams where everything is reliant on content that we're doing, making sense of the sorts. So in terms of trade efficiency, Infused looks really, really good on single target because it does a lot. But in AoE, it becomes diminished because it's only applying to one of those many targets. The other thing that I want to talk about is a mistake that I made on my part. When I did my testing earlier in the week for Magicka, I used Infused, but I only tested with the Berserker enchant, so gaining the weapon and spell damage. Now, the thing to mention about that is that it won't have 100% uptime because I'm not always on my front bar 100% of the time. So instead of having 100% uptime like it could potentially have, it had roughly a 70 to 80% uptime, so it wasn't as powerful. And the other thing is that Magicka builds are enabled by two enchants more so than their stamina counterparts. So Infused is really strong on a Magicka build if you use a shock or fire enchant, because two big important things happen with Magicka builds and status effects. Shock damage has a chance to apply minor vulnerability in the form of concussed. It lasts 4 seconds. It makes the enemy take 8% more damage. That's not a buff that anyone can apply on their own aside from minor vulnerability, which only comes from concussed or an item set known as Infallible Aether and maybe a few other things. But no one has access to that in pure single target DPS situation. Like, no one has that as a debuff based on in their kit. Like, there's no ability that applies that debuff. So that's a really big source of power for us. However, someone else can apply that for me in a group, and then if I'm doing the same thing, instead of getting 8% more DPS, it merely refreshes. So that's something to keep in mind, that's a situational advantage where it's not something that you always want to wear. It's like two people wearing Night Mother's Gaze. You only get the benefit of one. You don't need two people in it. So that doesn't become the end-all be-all bis because it's situational, it's operational. It enables damage instead of granting free damage that can stack further. So the other thing about that is that if you pair that with Wall of Lightning, you get 10% more damage if you spend 75 points into the Ritual Tree to gain Exploiter passive. So if you are running a Infused Shock enchant, that means every 2 seconds you throw off Shock, which has a 44% chance to proc minor vulnerability. So if you are proccing this off cooldown, you are going to almost have 100% uptime on this ability or on this status effect. So if you pair that with Wall of Lightning at 100% uptime, you're going to have off balance at almost 100% uptime, leading to an 18% inflation of DPS because these things will not stack with one another. So if I sat there and did the same thing, but someone else had already applied minor vulnerability with Wall of Lightning, I'm not gaining that 18% extra on top of the 18% they're already giving me. So stacking that has no advantage to me. I'd be better off using a different trait or a different enchant with a different wall of elements, ideally Blockade of Fire instead. So DPS parses that you're seeing a lot of are heavily inflated depending on these things, and they're contextual. So in single target, when you're solo, yeah, infused with a shock enchant looks disgustingly overpowered. Like, damn, that's really, really strong. But again, it enables operational DPS that has the chance to become mitigated or useless, because if someone else is already applying it, then I don't have to wear the same thing because I'm not going to gain the benefit out of it. So don't think that the infused shock enchant is meta going to be endgame BIS for every single build. It's going to be BIS for 1 or 2 builds so that they can give that to the rest of the people. Then other traits are going to start to come up in order. So precise, sharpened, Nirnhoned. Then those are going to be really strong. You can still use infused if you want to use a burning or a fire enchant. That will enable that your burning is up at 100%, but guess what? The same thing can happen. If someone else is already applying burning, then there's no advantage for you doing that, especially if you're using something like Blockade of Fire. With burning enemies take 20% more damage, if the target's already burning and I reapply it, I'm not gaining anything out of it because it's already getting that 20% bonus damage. So, you can use other traits or other enchants like the Absorb Magic enchant on an infused one that has 461 magicka every 2 seconds. That's really, really strong. It's also going to do roughly 1.5, 1.7k DPS because the ability can crit, all of that stuff. So it'll still be a strong enchant. It'll give you lots of regen, which means more DPS because less heavy attacking. So infused will still be a very strong trait, but again, remember, in pure single target. But as soon as we get into AoE, that's only hitting one target. That DPS becomes severely diminished. The other thing to talk about is that people think Maelstrom Staves are now no longer BIS. But again, this stuff is contextual. In a pure single target where I need to apply minor vulnerability for myself from this shock enchant, and I can use something else, yeah, the Maelstrom Staff isn't going to be as impressive. But if that is already applied for me, then this Maelstrom enchant will beat something else. So a classic setup that a lot of YouTubers are suggesting is, so you'll have one gear set that changes depending on what class you are. Then you're going to have a control, something that remains consistent, which is 5-piece Mother Sorrow. You run that with jewelry and a 2-piece body, or a 1-piece body and a staff. And that means that you have room to run a monster set, which a lot of people pair with Slimecraw, because you get 4.3% crit out of it. Really, really efficient. However, in terms of what this enables, this 3.5% crit or 4.3% crit will not beat the extra light and heavy attack damage that I'd gain out of a Maelstrom Staff. So that's another thing to keep in mind, that this setup, yeah, you can do that, but you can also just run a Maelstrom Staff, give this up, but still retain your 5-piece bonuses. So that's something to keep in mind as well, that this isn't something that's going to be an end-all be-all BIS. So ideally, with that, you'd run 5 Static Julie, 4 Mother Sorrow, or 5 Mother Sorrow on body, and then 1 Maelstrom Staff back bar, and then a crafted staff on your front bar, so that you could have that infused shock enchant, or you could just run like a Master Staff, or another Maelstrom Staff with poisons, or just whatever crafted staff you want, and you'd get the best of both worlds and still be at a DPS advantage. The other thing to talk about is that Infuse as a back bar trait, especially with a Maelstrom Staff, is not that good, because when you swap off of that bar, you're losing it. So the only way Infuse is good as double barred is if I pair this with, let's say, again, an Absorb Magic enchant. So I'm gaining this shock damage here for minor vulnerability. I can set them off balance if I'm using Wall of Lightning, and then on my back bar, I'm getting a shit ton of regen. But if someone's already applying this for me, then I have no advantage to this shock enchant. So I'd be better off using Flame. But again, if someone's applying Burning like a Dragonite, that becomes useless. So it becomes advantageous for me to run a Maelstrom Staff instead, so that I can get that light and heavy attack damage. The other thing to note about the Maelstrom Staff is if it's a Lightning Staff, each tick, as well as the splash damage of each tick of your lightning heavy attacks, will get this 1341 additional damage. That 1341 additional damage will be affected by CP. It can crit. It can be enabled by group debuffs. So it's really, really strong, and it has AoE potential. Because if I'm heavy attacking a target, if we look at the passive from Trifocus, shock heavy attacks damage nearby enemies for 129% of the damage done. So that means if I'm heavy attacking for 1k more, that 1k gets that 129% bonus on that splash damage. So the Maelstrom Lightning Staff becomes really strong. And if we use Infused with heavy attacking in Wall of Lightning, that means that it's going to get even more. So there are situations where Infused will still be BIS, but again, it's very niche, it's contextual, it depends on what content you're doing. So that covers pretty much everything for traits. So Charged is not as good as I thought it was. The reason that it was because I already said, hey, this is enabling Minor Vulnerability, a really powerful debuff. But the reason Infused didn't look that good was because I only tested with the Berserker enchant. But when I put a Shock enchant on the Infused beat Charged. So Charged is still not where it needs to be. It probably needs some additional modifier like status effects do additional damage on top of having a higher proc chance. That would be really cool to see to bring Charged a little bit back up in line. It's not a useless trait, but it's still being beaten by Infused. So in terms of single target solo application, Infused is best. Then, if you have Major Breach, then Nirnhoned and Precise are pretty much dead even, and then Sharpened comes last. Now, or not last, but in terms of what you want to aim for. Now, if you don't have Major Breach, then Sharpened beats Nirnhoned and Precise because you don't have as much penetration. Because the other thing to talk about is that penetration has diminishing returns in terms of DPS. The closer and closer you get to mitigating a target to 0 resistance, the less efficiency out of penetration you get. So the first 5,000 penetration you gain out of reducing 18.2k is way more than removing the last 5,000 penetration so an enemy reaches 0. Because if you look at the value, since it's dealing with mitigation and percent efficiencies, as you get closer and closer to 0, the amount of damage that you're gaining is being mitigated because it's a percent of a percent of a percent. So it's being mitigated. So as the closer and closer you get to 0, penetration becomes less enticing. Now, it's still very worth reaching out to, but in terms of operational DPS and like what I'm giving up. So if I run Sharpened, that means I can't run Nirnhoned or Precise or Infused. So I'm giving up an operational loss. So in terms of solo, Sharpened is only really good if I have low penetration. But with CP and Major Breach, I have enough penetration where that diminishing return out of Sharpened starts to become negligible. But in other situations, when I have it, or I don't have it, then Sharpened becomes really, really nice. So Sharpened is not a dead trait still, but again, it's contextual. It depends. What am I doing? The other thing is to note that people say, oh, well, in endgame rating, we have really fancy debuffs like Alkosh, Infused Crusher, Spriggan, or not Spriggan's, Night Mother's Gaze, Sunderflame, all of these wonderful debuffs. However, in an AoE situation, you can't hit every single mob with Alkosh because it has a very small radius. Infused Crusher enchant with Torrigs, even at that, can only be applied to 1, maybe 2 targets with perfect cooldown proccing. So you're not able to hit every target. Major Breach, the only way that you can apply that AoE is with a Stamina Warden using Subterranean Assault, which is a DPS deficit for the raid because they're not in a good spot. Or if a Stamina Dragonite uses Noxious Breath to apply Major Fracture to everything. But again, he's going to have to go around this big circle, casting it over and over. He's going to lose DPS. So Sharpened becomes better in AoE situations as well because you're not able to reduce everything's mitigation because you're not able to enable or to enact the same power. Like Sunderflame, you have to heavy attack every single enemy you want that on. Alkosh, everything has to be condensed into where you activate that synergy. Major Fracture and Breach. There are only 2 forms of AoE in the game. Otherwise, a tank has to taunt every single one of them every 15 seconds. So yeah, Sharpened becomes a little bit better in those situations because you're not able to debuff all of them like you can in a raid with a single target boss. So it's all about context in Horns of the Reach, and I keep driving on that. It's all about understanding why these things are powerful and where they're powerful. So understanding what kind of content am I doing. Maybe I'm in a raid and I have aggressive Warhorn. Crit chance becomes really, really strong. So precise is going to start coming ahead of other traits. Maybe if I have someone guarding me too, that's minor force. I'm gaining lots and lots of crit hit damage, so precise goes up in efficiency. However, maybe I'm at 93% crit chance and I gain precise. All right, I'm losing 2% crit chance because I can't have more than 100%. So maybe precise isn't as optimal for me as something else. So it's all about context, information, discerning what is best for you and making sense out of it. So I will have the stream linked in the description so you can watch and look through that. I'm not going to put timestamps on it because it was very long-winded. You can kind of just click through it. But we talked a lot about making sense of the meta and figuring out why some of these things are much stronger than they appear, where they start to falter, and so on. So I highly suggest looking at today's stream. It was about an hour and a half, maybe like an hour of real information. You can skip through question answering because most of the information that I focused on was done in a presentation style instead of an answering question style. So anytime you see me presenting information instead of answering questions, check that out. Really, really suggest it so that you can learn to be able to understand where these things make sense, how to better approach Horns of the Reach, and understanding the meta and making the meta work for you. Because that's what Horns of the Reach is all about, is making things work for you. Realizing the strengths of these things because they're all contextual. They require a variable to be controlled in order to be powerful. Like we talked about, Sharpened is only good if you're not debuffing a lot of enemies with penetration or reduction. So if you don't have those, then it becomes really good. But if you do have them, it's It relies on a variable, a check mark. It says, hey, do you have this? If so, pass go, use this. But if not, then yeah, you don't want to use it. You want to use something else. So it's all about understanding and then tackling that content based on that understanding. So that's what we covered in today's stream. It was pretty long in terms of information. We talked about a lot of different variables. We talked about the importance of Mother's Sorrow, how that's really good. We talked about why Leviathan doesn't have necessarily the same amount of importance for stamina builds. We talked a little bit about stamina traits. Not too much has changed with them. And then we talked a lot about the Torg's Pact fiasco to a little bit more depth, talking about how it'll translate after it fixes, what I'd like to personally see done with it, balance changes, and then just banter in between. So listening to me answer questions, put in my own thoughts and perspectives on things, and so on. So I highly suggest checking out the stream. I tried to keep it shorter than usual so that we could get more information out with less fluff in between. So it was a really eventful, productive discussion today, so I really, really suggest checking that out. But again, if you don't want to, pretty much everything you need to know is happened when I talked about it here, but I can't talk about everything. It'd take hours. Monday, we're also having another PTS update with the final balance changes. A lot of stuff could potentially happen in that could just rework everything we know and have all tested. So keep in mind that this is the PTS. Everything is subject to change. We don't know for sure, so don't make a shiny set of gold gear and expect it to make it through unscathed. Like, if you're out there buying perfect traits of stuff like, oh, hey, maybe I'm buying a shit ton of infused Moondancer, or not Moondancer, Mother Sorrow staves or precise staves, hey, we don't know if that's going to reach the same way. So don't like go overboard spending money or resources into these things that have a chance to become useless, because it is the PTS. So just keep that in mind. Be a little bit more mindful that these things are subject to change. ZeniMax loves to change things. They are actually very reactionary to the people's cries. Maybe a little bit too much sometimes, but they do listen to us. They just don't necessarily always comment on it. So they're seeing a lot of this stuff. Torg's Pact is getting fixed on Monday, hopefully, if it reaches, like, if it actually works. Hopefully we see some more balance changes with it to get it a little bit more in line. Hopefully we see some class adjustments so that we can bring in more Templars, Nightblades, stuff like that, and so on. But yeah, stream on again on Monday talking about the patch changes, talking about what I'll be testing with that, and then asking for feedback. Hey, what do you want to see tested with these new changes? coming on Monday, and then moving into Horns of the Reach, I will be remaking builds with updated information. There'll be shorter builds because a lot of the core will remain the same, but it's just changing traits, Mundus Stones, a few stuff like that, and then working a lot on PvP builds. I'm currently working on my Magic and Nightblade and my Stamina Nightblade PvP build. I'm trying to slowly get back into updating written guides. I updated my Bloodletter build on the official forums. I'll try and get that on Deltia's site soon. I'm not sure if I'm going to continue updating Deltia's site moving into Horns of the Reach. I'm not sure if I'm going to make my own even, because I don't have as much time as people think I do. I'm a very busy person. I like to at least be able to be a human being. Hey, imagine that. So I have other stuff going on, so please bear with me. Look to others for insight. I'll always try and comment on, like, hey, maybe this is contextual information. Don't always take things at eye level. Test, realize that everything has variables that are reliant on it, and try and understand why things are the way they are. And that's what I'm also here for, so that we can all do that together. So thank you if you joined me on today's stream. Otherwise, if not, hopefully you've understood a little bit more about moving into Horns of the Reach, have a bit better clarity, and you're able to make sense of like why some of results between content creators is a little bit different, because everything is very, very contextual, and some people are more biased in terms of their deliverance because their situations are different. So like someone who's giving a presentation about endgame raid DPS in a really min-max group like Alcast makes amazing content, but he's focused on endgame min-max perfection about a group that has amazing synergy and at the drop of a dime can change their entire strategy if they need to. If you don't have access to that, some of his information might not be as important to you or have a chance to become redundant. So it's all about giving a better viewpoint so that you have a very large selection and understanding of things, so that you can say, oh, hey, that works well here because of this. This criteria is being... I don't have access to that, so, oh, hey, now this becomes a little bit better. So that's my goal: learning, understanding, teaching, etc., etc. So again, thank you all so much for watching, but I will see you guys around.